Thank you, Alice, for agreeing to talk to us about your experience in what was Southern Rhodesia, but is now known as Zimbabwe. So to start the conversation, can you tell us why you became, or you wanted to become, a missionary?
Well, I do think that people in the churches, ordinary churchgoers, knew a lot more about mission in those days than they do today. And in those days, there was a distinction between applying to be a teacher abroad or being a missionary.
And what was it you applied for?
Well, what I had experienced was wanting to be a missionary, and that meant proclaiming the gospel, nothing to do with being at school or teaching, because, well, in the churches, ordinary churches, every church had at least once a year a missionary weekend. And we always had a missionary who was on leave, who came from wherever he was living, to take the services on a Sunday, and or perhaps a weekday to tell us about the country he was in and about the work.
Was it that sort of experience that made you think about becoming a missionary yourself?
That's what started it, because there was a special. I was home. I was teaching already, and I was home for the holidays, staying with my mother and my brother and grandmother, and we had a fantastic service in the morning that I'd been at, and I can't explain what happens, because you can't really, when you've been especially moved by something. He was talking, I think, about China. Yes, it was about China, because that's where he worked. And I can't tell you what he said, but it made me want to do something similar.
Was that service that you attended, was it here in Swansea?
It was where I was living at the time, in Meath, and the service was in Meath. And it was the morning service, and my mother hadn't attended because she was getting dinner for us all. And when I came home full of enthusiasm and talking about it, she guessed that I'd been moved by it, and of course was frightened at the prospect, which I hadn't even considered.
So I believe when things got moving in your application and everything was accepted, you went out to Rhodesia, Zimbabwe in 1953.
That was years later than that event, because it was obviously not suitable to do it at the time. It had frightened the family, and I put it out in my mind. I didn't even consider it. I got a teaching job, I was happy, and I didn't. But the thought that wanting to go, the pressure was similar to what I imagine it's similar to what it feels like when somebody's called to ministry.
So when you went out to Rhodesia, what did you find when you got out there? Because I think you were sailed out there, for the weeks. And then you had a long train journey to actually get to where you were going to work. So when you got there, what did you find? Was it a church? Was it a school? What was it?
Of course, the whole situation had changed a lot in the meantime. And I had, by that stage, I mean, it's years after the first experience. And at this stage, things were changing dramatically in the churches everywhere. And it was immediately after the war, after the Second World War. And there were missionary societies who were now interested particularly in spreading education and hospitals, so that people who felt called to be missionaries were also wanted as teachers or nurses or doctors. And the call got confused in a sense. And I had felt a call to be a missionary, to preach the gospel, if you like, whereas the missionary society's idea was much more to develop secondary education throughout Africa.
And that was what you initially got involved with.
That's what they wanted me for. Without my knowing, without my realizing, I was a hook. I was hooked because I could teach science, and there was a new secondary school just started in Southern Rhodesia. There was no secondary education for Africans. There were two good government schools in the capital and in Bulawayo. But apart from that, there were no others. So there were no teachers to teach.
So perhaps you were disappointed when you got out there, but were you able to help with any Christian way of living and helping?
I mean, it's interesting actually, because there were, within a few years, there were people coming from Britain employed as teachers, employed by the school or by the country. And I can't tell you how the Africans knew there was any difference, but I mean, the only difference as far as was visibly concerned was that I was paid a ministerial stipend, and it was under the discipline of the church, not the school. Well, the church and the school, but somebody who came straight from England just to teach. When I say only to teach, they were called direct appointments, and they had big salaries. So the only difference really, because one of my great friends was just as much a missionary as I was, but she was not paid by the Missionary Society. She didn't candidate with the Missionary Society as I had to do. And for some reason, I don't know how the Africans knew, but they did. And there were two of us in the school, and we were called sister. The Africans didn't call my mistress, they called me sister. Whereas direct appointments were called by their name. And I don't know how they knew, but they seemed to know.
So was there a church near your school?
The school was part of a huge institution. Because before the secondary school started, there was already a primary school on the side. A wonderful church at the Middle there, which is one of the oldest buildings. There was a two-year course to train builders. And there was what is called teacher training. But you couldn't imagine what teacher training was like. And it was like my grandmother had experienced in South Wales 50 years earlier. That was just my children.
They were just learning to read and write.
Yeah, they were the cream of the primary schools. And a good leap forward for them was to become a teacher. So there was a 2-year teacher training course. But I mean, they had no secondary education.
Can we go back to the church? Was there a minister or a vicar or who was in charge of your church?
Well, there was a speaker in a circuit, and there was a circuit minister. But the principal of the school was the principal of the whole institution was a minister. And in my case, when I first went, it was a white person. Because you have to remember that Southern Rhodesia was very like South Africa. It wasn't like other African places. It was a protectorate, not just a colony. And it was ruled by white people. And it was much more like South Africa than any other African country. And we were in a way Catholics, because we didn't quite belong to I degree. And the Missionary Society in Britain considered this to be rather old-fashioned and out of date because the senior missionaries who'd been there for years, were very much part of the white population. And that was we had this problem. And I call myself an interim person because at every stage of everything in my work in life, I've been in an interim position. The church was changing, the schools were changing.
You were in the
And I was always in the middle.
So you were actually out there for 10 years.
I was there longer than that, actually. But when you went first, in those days, you had to be 5 years. I mean, I was employed not by the school, I was employed by the Missionary Society. And I was a very missionary. But my main job, of course, was teaching. The secondary school had been open, starting. And it had 2 years when I got there. That in the whole country, the whole of Southern Rhodesia, there were just 2 educated African graduates. Literally, both of them were in our staff. The principal, the man who started the secondary school, and his colleague, who later became the head of the school as well. But they'd been educated in South Africa with Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu.
Did you ever meet those people?
No, that I heard about the school, of course, because that's where they came from. Otherwise, there was no education in Rhodesia for them. But they've been, I don't know how I think they've been sent by the church probably as very clever people and good Christians as well. I mean, Professor Malala, my headmaster, had just had a year in America. He'd been sent by the church, paid for him and trained for a year, so he had experience. And they started, he started school with 1 class, and the classroom was built. And then the following year, the building was built a 2nd classroom, and the second year, and I got there in the 3rd year. And of course, there was no science at all.
So I mean, you obviously concentrated on teaching stuff. Were you able to sort of spread the gospel in any way? And how did you do that?
But we could have done a lot more, and I think we should have done a lot more. And I'm critical of the conditions. I'm critical of the Missionary Society, actually.
But we're not allowing you to do more.
But it wasn't that they didn't allow it, but there was no provision. There was no job. You couldn't do missionary work in the African area unless you had a car. And they did it was applied for, and in fact the car was provided for our other institution. And the women, well, they could have, I suppose, I don't know what they did about this. They were a long, long way from us. But we did not get a car.
You mentioned that women. I mean, how many women were you in the school?
That's interesting, actually, because when I first went there in 1953, there were two.
And yourself?
Well, my colleague and I were both new, and we were both going to, one was going to replace the boarding person. Well, that lady had been there for 15 years. She was very set in her ways too. And she was sent to Northern Rhodesia, actually. She didn't stay there very long, but
So you would get 2 women?
2 women. And of course they were African staff. But the conditions for girls to board, I mean, you can't imagine them today. They were primitive and extreme because we had no money to support, they had to pay for it. And, well, I could describe it to you, but I mean, they had little houses, 6 or 8, I can't remember which, little houses. Each house had 2 rooms and concrete floors. And a little group of girls in the charge of the senior prefect. There were no beds, they slept on the floor, concrete floor. They brought their own bed in with them, which was unrolled in you. And the sleeping room became the only room. There were two rooms, one where they slept and the other which they ate, but they had a little kitchen outside and they had to cook their own food.
How old were they?
Well, the secondary girls who were doing what you might say is 11 plus, some of them were 20. They were grown women. In fact, the head girl was married to our headmaster in the end, and she is now quite well known. She became well known and has become very well known in recent years.
How were the youngest children to school?
Well, you see, there was a primary school. Oh no! Oh, good gracious, no! No, they were already adult, really. Well, almost adult, teenagers. And I mean, the teachers were only 18-year-olds anyway, and so it was very, very different. And
perhaps because it's telling enjoyable, perhaps you consider doing another session where we can talk a little bit more about.
Well, maybe because it changed dramatically, of course. Bore no relationship to the beginning, the end.